My name is Tom Frost. I was born in San Antonio in 1927. Well, everybody thinks that the Frost family lives differently than everyone else, but when I grew up like a kid, there was no mention from my parents of anything about the family and their prominence and so forth. I was told by my mother, by both her family, which was Dr. Herf, and had come here in about the 1850s, and of course my father's family, Tom Frost, came here in the 1870s. He came to Texas in the 50s. But I was never told how prominent they were or how important the bank was. I was really managed, and I've tried to do it with my own children, that they just weren't somebody different. They were like anyone else. And some of the greatest experiences I guess I've had, you can't live in a situation where the bank particularly is as significant as it is in the business, that even as a child you don't realize that the bank is an important element of San Antonio. But the greatest thing that happened to me growing up was, my family never really promoted and told me how wonderful the family was and what it was. And then when I went off on my own, and we'll talk about going outside of Texas, Harry Truman invited me to join his organization called the U.S. Army right after the World War II. And then after that, I went to the University of Wyoming, and on there graduated from Washington Lee in Virginia. And every one of those places enhanced my own personal esteem, because when I got in the Army, when I was up at the University of Wyoming, and when I was out at Washington Lee, nobody really there knew who Frost was, and I was being accepted for who I was. No, he died in 1903. That was the day that year that my father was born. I did get to know I got to know 5 of his children. My grandfather, 2 great uncles, and 2 great aunts. And particularly one of the great aunts, which was the youngest daughter of Tom Frost, told me a little bit about him and why he signed the Articles of Secession and why he was in San Antonio. And it was really a good window to hear Lucy, because she talked about Papa. And as the youngest daughter, apparently he confided maybe in her a little more than in the others. Well, the interesting thing about it, of course, is that we all know that he was a frontier person. Before coming to San Antonio, he had come to Austin College as a teacher, a professor, when Austin College was the only college in Texas. This was 1852-4, and he was probably one of the few people in Texas that had a college degree. He studied law under Sam Houston and Yoakum's office, who were trustees of Austin College, where he was an assistant professor. His law license was signed by R.E.B. Baylor, the judge that Baylor University was named for, and really went out almost immediately after teaching for about a year and a half at Austin College, went up to the frontier, which was just north of Waco, about where Abilene is now, and helped start Comanche County. And this was a place where it was a frontier, and by that I mean the Indians were still perpetrating difficulty to the people coming in. And my great-grandfather, knowing this through his child, was working hard not only to build Comanche County, it didn't exist, but actually to help fight the Indians. And that's where he served a 90-day degree time as a Texas Ranger, and was asked by McCullough and the governor to get a troop together, really to go out and push the Indians back. And his plea with the government was that they weren't doing enough to protect the people on the frontier. And so when secession came, he did join the Confederate forces, but only to take over the forts that were on the west, all the way from the Red River down to Mason out here north of San Antonio, to help maintain the peace with the Indians. His brother had come to San Antonio. He was a bachelor, and he got here sometime right after the Civil War, and that's the one that later on my great-grandfather went into business with him here in San Antonio because he couldn't practice law against the United States, because only people that had connections with the federal government could practice law. So he was down here to stay away from the frontier because it wasn't protected, and in that is where he started the business here, since he couldn't practice law. That's when he started his business to sell goods to farmers and ranchers, and had a warehouse to take care of them, and from that had to provide the funds to finance them until their crops or their animals were sold, the wool and the mohair and the cotton and so forth. And it soon got to be that the need for financing, there wasn't much money at all right after the war. There were no banks, really. There were only private banks. There were no commercial established banks chartered under state or federal government until one by Brackenridge, who was a sympathizer and got a national charter. But make a long story short, financing got to be the important thing that the businesses needed, so he sold his mercantile business to a guy named Beretta, who was a longtime friend and had been all through his life, and kept the banking business because that was the way to really serve the public in a need of something they really needed to have. Of course, we count 1868. You got to remember, the Civil War was over in '65, so he came down here in San Antonio and Waco, the family did, and we don't know when his brother came, but he came back and threw in with his brother about 1870, and it was still a mercantile firm called Fitch, Frost and Brother, and they bought out Fitch and then Frost and Brother, and then later John, the brother, died, and it was just T.C. Frost. So he started the mercantile firm with his brother sometime around 1870, and somewhere around '68, my father and I found one of the books of the mercantile firm that someone had deposited some gold with them as merchants, but evidently they must have had a vault or so forth. So we decided, Dad and I, that we'd count the time, the beginning of the Frost Bank, when that first deposit was found in a real record, and that was 1868. We'll be 150 years old next year. He died in '03, and the sons had gone to Princeton. Therein lies a whole other story about Dr. Seeley and San Antonio Academy and Woodrow Wilson, who was president of Princeton, later president of the United States. But the boys all went to Princeton, and shortly after they graduated, I don't really have the year, was when the colonel died, and his son, which would be my grandfather, another Tom Frost, took over the bank. His brother Joe was in there with him, his brother John, and particularly a man, the cashier named McElhenney, who probably provided the gray hair in the private bank that my grandfather, as a very young man, relatively only shortly after coming out of college, had to hold the bank together, keep it going, and he ran the bank until about in the 20s. I don't know, it'd be about 1926, when his brother, he decided to take it easy and give the banking business, which was not a big business, to his brother, and the other brother, John, decided just to retire about that time. So Uncle Joe was the one that I knew intimately, and that was the guy that ran the bank from about the middle 20s, 1920s, on through the Depression until he died in the 40s. And we had a seamless change from father to son, uncle to nephew, and on down right through my time, where there's been a continuous, you might say, management based on the same principles that we've heard right from my great-grandfather on down till today. What we now call the Frost philosophy is one of how we really run this business and why the business has been so successful. because I was told that we were in the people business, that we used finance to provide the service the people needed, but that my life would be involved in finding and recruiting and training and retaining good people of good character to be the members of the staff, and then to go on and find good people of character who would borrow the money and handle and give us the deposits. And so I've been taught that we were in the people business, and that our real success is that we would grow and prosper building long-term relationships with individuals. And that's why this bank and this organization has been so successful through the wars, depressions, government financing, which we never took, neither in the 30s and neither in recently. And we are so strong because, and I think we succeeded where most, all except for us, the top 10 banks in Texas failed in the 80s, is because we did business with people, not transactions with businesses. Like we didn't try to finance cotton. My uncle told me we didn't finance cattle so much by the head. So what we did is we financed people in the cattle business. And he went on to say that, of course, some of them we would lend without worrying about security. Some of them we'd ask for cattle as security. Some of them, because of their character, we wouldn't lend at all. But the biggest thing we were doing was not lending to cattle industry, but to people in the cattle business. And this saved us, I think, in the 80s, because while we had real big problems with oil and gas and real estate, we succeeded, I think, because we did business with people who were in the oil and gas and in the real estate. I never learned about profit until after I was taught of how to really run the bank and keep the bank safe and sound. And profit was something you just had to do and became good at it. You had to do that to succeed, but you did it by providing a service that was needed, and in providing it efficiently, it would make a profit. That's why this, in one of the books about Built to Last, said businesses who put profit at the head of their goal did not succeed. Those that profit was secondarily but a necessary element did make it. And Frost Bank was a business that would, in that book, would have been built to last. Therein lies the full story of the family, and the bank is one that's based on values and principles that have existed over the years and haven't changed. Except for the U.S. Army, I never had another job that paid me any money in my life, and that was Frost Bank. When I was growing up, I wanted to be the usual things a young boy wants: a fireman, a policeman, a cowboy, all the good, exciting things. Banker wasn't one of them. I took over when Dad died, and it was a natural, normal thing, because what had happened to all of us, looking back on it, when the elder person who was running things started running toward the end of their life, a lot of the management and a lot of the job was just sort of transferred over in a very natural, normal way, and a way probably that every business ought to do anyway. Of course, World War I was a terrific time when the whole banking system had to go help finance the war. And of course, what people probably don't really remember is that after World War I, there was a decline in business, which usually happens when a war ends, because everybody's been geared up building the war. So that was a time when the bank did satisfactorily. And then, of course, during the Depression would be the time Uncle Joe was in charge. And that was the time when San Antonio had their first real bank failure. It was called the City Central Bank. It was the biggest bank. It was down at the corner of Houston and Navarro. The building's still there today. It's now a hotel. Most of our competitors are now hotels. Anyway, the City Central went broke in '33, and very shortly after it went broke, a run occurred when people came to the Frost Bank. I never will understand why, but they came here and they were paid off. The bank stayed open until every single person in line got their money paid, and Uncle Joe had what he told me you always had to have. Well, Uncle Joe told me, we are not big enough to be saved by the federal government. We've got to be sure we have the capital, the liquidity, and the strength of the sound assets to save ourselves. Well, that was in the 80s, and that's when every single major bank but us in Texas went broke, and just about every single savings and loan went broke. And what happened is the oil price collapsed twice in a very significant way. And of course, when you've been financing oil and gas and you finance an economy based on it, people probably don't even remember now, it's been so long ago, but that was a significant depression here in Texas. And what happened to us is, of course, we did business with people that were in oil and gas, were in real estate where the problems came. And one of the things that I had to do during the time of the 80s was we had losses that we had to actually occur and realize that some of the loans weren't going to be paid. And I had to figure out ways to maintain the capital of the bank to keep it safe and sound, so that what happened with the banks that went broke is that they had loans they had to charge down, and they didn't have the capital to, after charge it down, to really have the trust of the people to stay in business. And I had to find ways to raise additional capital, which I did from other assets we had. We ended up the 80s with substantially the same capital and the same deposits as when we started it, which is everybody else, of course, as I say, went broke of the banks and savings and loans. So those were tough times. Well, Mexico is really a nice side issue that came from my Uncle Joe. His wife died in World War II in the so-called the flu epidemic they had. He had two young men, Joe and John, his sons, that he had to raise as a bachelor. And while he did that, he taught himself and had teachers come in to learn Spanish. He decided that would be a valuable thing to do in a place here. We had plenty of relationships with people from Mexico, including Mexican banks, because San Antonio was the first stop in the railroad and the first place that most Mexicans could come and enjoy the United States. And here was Frost Bank. We were the banker for Madero, who came to San Antonio to help, and when during the revolution to flee, the people were after him during the revolution. This is where he wrote the plan of San Luis, which was the one that actually was the cry for the revolution. Anyway, Uncle Joe was the first U.S. banker that went down to Mexico to call on Mexican banks in their own language and solicit their business, so to speak. And he encouraged me. I was encouraged by my parents, who didn't speak Spanish, to take Spanish lessons when my little school didn't give Spanish lessons. I went down there and spent some time with the central bank. We first started at the University of Mexico for a little while, but that was too many U.S. students there, and I spent time in one of the major commercial banks and in the central bank, and actually was down behind the windows with young people who spoke no English. And so I got to learn not only about the banking system, but a little bit about the culture and the people of who a Mexican was and what they were interested in, what they did. And of course, it was really easy for me to translate that when I came back here into San Antonio, made it tick, because we were a Mexican city that had been taken over by the United States, and I was the first representative I was a representative of the bank with the Mexican-American Chamber of Commerce. I was the only Anglo, but I was Spanish-speaking Anglo that spent a lot of time with that group. I do happen to have a wife that spoke Spanish before English. Her family had been miners in Monterey during the Revolution, and in 1912 her mother and her family had to leave to come up here. So when we traveled down there and went to conventions, I at least we were a couple who made good friends with the bankers and their wives. And she actually at one point, I got to know a lot of the presidents of Mexico, and at one point we were at a luncheon where my wife ended up being the translator for the past president of Mexico, Diaz Ordaz, when he didn't really speak any English. Well, one of the things we learned from my great-grandfather was that you needed to support your community, because a bank, a financial institution, would only grow as well as its community grew. So your policies of how you handle your customers, of how you help build, and part of building the business was go out and being in civic affairs and so forth. So our whole idea has always been that building relationships, not just with our customers, but with the whole communities, are the things that are important. And our mission statement is we'll grow and prosper building long-term relationships. We do that to this day. I will tell you a side issue that's an interesting thing about my schooling is that my really work as in the civic work here in this town started when the idea for it started when I was 15 years old and a sophomore in high school at TMI. And I had a good friend named Bob Klein. When I was a sophomore at TMI, he came to me and he says, "Tom," he says, "you're bigger than most of all the rest of the guys here. Why didn't you go out for football here at TMI? You played football at the academy, and I think you need to come and go out." And I said, "Well, I don't know. It hurts. I don't like it." He said, "Look," this is Bob Klein when I was 15 years old. He says, "all of us have to participate and do our share in making things work and happen." And I've never forgotten it. He got me I went out for football. We had 23 people out for football. That's 22 is two teams, and I was number 23. My last year, though, I ended up being a starting end and a starting tackle and got my varsity letter. And the reason I went out and worked was I realized the bank wouldn't grow and prosper without our doing things to help San Antonio grow. And of course, everybody had to do their share. I've never seen us doing as well as we're doing right now. And what we learned, even during my lifetime, I think, was that we really had to work together, and that by doing things together, there's no telling what we could have done. Because I say that the most important year in San Antonio's history is not 1836 when the Alamo fell, or what was it, 1761 when the first Spaniards came here, but it was 1968 when we opened up the hemisphere and in April, and opened up the medical center with the medical school in September. And what we did there was we had one that was the medical school that we had a big controversy among ourselves, and finally somehow one way or another we got it done and built a beautiful medical center. But the hemisphere was one time when we finally did say we're going to work together, and we had people of every political ilk. We had the unions, we had businesses, we had everybody really working to build a fair, to build the tourism business here, which was really languishing because we didn't have any hotels. We had 2 or 3 of them, but we have a convention here, and you have to have a dinner split between 2 hotels because we didn't have a convention center. Well, you know, I also learned from Jane Austen that there was usually a street that was the high rent street in most every city. And of course we know in New York it was either Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue. Probably Fifth Avenue is where the stores were and so forth. And the interesting thing about San Antonio is our high rent district became the Riverwalk. And whoever decided to, I know I've forgotten the name of the architect, decided to save the river, and of course it was done by the WPA and Maury Maverick in the 30s, but it's become the high rent district downtown, and it's, of course, and the reason we're here is both the reason is why San Antonio's here is because the river and the San Pedro Springs caused the Spaniards to stop here and see this as a place to grow and develop. I love to spend time up there in the family place at Bernie, which is only 30 miles away, but it's where I see my children and my grandchildren, now my great-grandchildren there on the few weekends we get to spend there, so I like that. I happen to have enjoyed playing tennis, which is another real benefit of having people around you that encourage you. My grandfather, who was a great grandson of Dr. Herf, he was also a physician here. John Herf played tennis, and I can remember as a grandchild of his at the age of about 9, realizing that my grandpa, Big Daddy I call him, was on the tennis court playing with me, and he got me to take lessons, and I wasn't that good at it, but I enjoyed playing tennis all my life. My father taught me the outdoors and how to hunt birds and deer and so forth, so I enjoy those things. Of course, the biggest thing that affects your life later on that you've got to be interested in and happy with, or as your family. And we had 4 wonderful boys, and I can remember having to make serious decisions on my time as to when we'd be together and we weren't. And one of the things I guess we've done all our life is found places to stay together on weekends and so forth. Well, the words of wisdom that I have is that character endures. I've had the great pride of having successors, not successors, but predecessors. I've had the great pride of many predecessors being successful in what they did. And I think the important thing here is to work hard, be successful in what you do, and make your own way in life.